kudos to making it this far. Now we're going to be looking about Python loops in this tutorial. So Python has two primitive loop commands. So you either find yourself using the while loop or the for loop. Okay, so we're going to look at the while loop first, then we'll look at the for loops. Then that will be it for this tutorial. So now for the while loop, we can execute a set of commands as long as a condition is true. That's how the while loops work first. So for you to use a while loop, the command you want to run has to be true first. So the while loop will test for the condition first before it then proceeds to print the command. So let's look at this code here. So I'm looking at I is equals to 1. I have declared here I already is equals to 1. So now my code says while I is less than 6. So this is how it works. You write the command while. This is a keyword in Python. You would use I is less than, that's we use the arithmetic operator here and use the less than sign to test for while I is less than 6. So we'll check for this code, and this code must equate true before the condition here would run. Okay, so now this code would first test and see if I is less than 6 before proceeding to print I to the console. Okay, now notice on line 4 we have I plus equal to 1. So this is simply like the same thing as saying I plus plus. That's like incrementing. So you need to increment your code. If not, your code will loop forever. So you need to always push your code higher for the next sequence so that your code has a time frame, it has an ending point. That's why we have this line 4. So if you would ignore this line, your code is going to loop forever and probably crashing out your system. Okay, so let's run it and see what happens in the command line. We see that we have 1 to 6, so it starts from 1 to 6. So this code will run from 1 until 5, because when it comes again to test at 6, it will notice that 6 is not less than 6. Okay, so if I want to make this code loop 6, I will have to use the less than or equal to sign. Okay, so now the while loop requires relevant variables to be ready. Okay, and as we need to have a variable to test for, like we have on line 1, I is equals to 1. Okay, so now in the example here you're seeing now we have already set I is equals to 1. This is the variable that the while loop requires for it to run. So the next thing I want to show you guys is the break statement. So how would we use the break statement in Python using a while loop? So let's take this piece of code here. So on line 1, I am declaring again I is equals to 1. Then on line 2, you've all seen this before. Why I is less than 6, I'm testing to see if a condition is true or not before I can run a certain action. Same thing I did the last time. So I'm printing I to the console. Okay, so now see how I would use a break statement. So now on my line 4, I'm saying if I is equals to 3. So when looping through this code, when I is equals to 3, break the code. So when I get to this condition and I see that I is equals to 3 at that point, my code will break. I won't have the code running all the way to 6. It's going to stop when I is equals to 3. So let me run it in the console and show you quickly. So you can see in my console here, I have what I is less than 6. It stops at 3 because why? I is equals to 3 at that sequence. So it breaks out of the code. Okay, so now opposite of break, we have continue in Python. So we want to continue if I is equals to 3. We want to skip that iteration and continue. So let me clear my console real quick. So this is what I want to do. I would add the continue here. I will say okay, continue like this. This is a keyword in Python. Then I want to continue. Okay, let me reverse the case. I want to Control Z. So I want to increment first before I print I. Okay. Okay, so this is what I want to do. I want to first of all check if I is less than 6, increment it, then check if I is equals to 3. If I is equals to 3, I want to skip that iteration and continue. So what do I mean by that? So what is going to happen in this my code is that it's going to loop, check to see if this condition is right. If the condition is right, it increments that by 1. Then it checks to see if that number I have incremented by is equals to 3. If it is not equals to 3, it will skip this loop right here and print that figure to the console. But when it gets to 3, it will not print it out. It will just continue skipping 3, proceeding to the next one. So let me show you the result in the console for you to understand better. So you see that my iteration starts from 2, because once I check if I is less than 6, on my next line here, I'm already incrementing I by 1 before printing it. Okay, so in my next line on line 4, I am checking to see if that 2 now is equals to 3. If it is not, skip it and print it. That's why I have 2 on the console. But on the next sequence, I will increment it by 1 again, and it's going to be 3. So when I checks and see that it is equals to 3, it will continue. So continue means that just go back to the loop and start again. And continue from your last sequence, which is 3. So it comes from the last sequence, 3, and adds 4, and continues until I is not less than 6. So you see my result here, I don't have 3, because at that 3 sequence, it skips it and starts from another iteration, which is going to be 4. So that's how you would use the continue statement in on while loops. Okay, so what we have last that we can test for on while loops also is to have an else statement. So an else statement, we can run an else statement to print a condition one time to the console when our loop has ended. Okay, so okay, let me add an else statement here and show you how it will look like. Let me add an else statement here. To add an else statement, I must be on the same line with the while. So I will say else on the next line, print let's say I is no longer less than 6. Okay, I is no longer less than 6. Okay, let's run that. Let's clear up the console. So let me show you something real quick. So now see, I have an message as the last item after my iteration that what I is no longer than 6. Is no longer less than 6, sorry. So now, what does this else do? This else just prints it prints a block of code after your condition is no longer true. Okay, so when this condition is done, that's when this else will happen. But take note, if I add a break statement here, I will not get that condition printed out to the console, because the code broke at this point, so it will not go all the way down. So let me show you that, and you would see a practical example of it. So let's run it again and we'll see. You see that it stops at 2. We don't get to see the else statement there because we use the break. Okay, so that's what you need to know basically for while loops. Now let's look at for loops. Okay, so a for loop is used for iterating over a sequence. So that sequence can either be a list, a tuple, a dictionary, or a set, or a string. Basically, loops are used to loop over sequence. Okay, now this is very unlike your for keyword in other programming languages, and it works more like an iterator method. Okay, so while loops can execute a set of statements, one for each item in the list, tuple, and dictionary, as the case may be. So let me give you an example so you can see what I'm talking about. So we're going to use a for loop, sorry, to loop through a list, and you will see how the for loop works. Okay, so let's use this code here. So now this is a list of fruits, like I always use. So now I want to use a for loop using the for keyword here and an iterator, which is the X, to loop through this list, each item in my list, and produce a result to the console. Okay, so now the for loop, it does not require an indexing for it to start. For like the as compared to the while loop, we need to like set an indexing. That's where we use I is equals to 1 to start the loop. That's the condition needed to test for before it printed the action to the console. But for while loops, for for loops, we don't need to index a variable to start. So this X just starts at your counter, at your iterator, all through your list. So when it's done, it on its own exits itself from the for loop. Okay, you don't need to increment, you don't need an indexing variable on loops. You just have to like set your iterator and what you want to loop through. It could be a list, it could be a set, a dictionary, as the case may be. So if I print this to the console, I should be seeing my loops print each item in the fruit list to me on the console, like we have here. Okay, so we can also use a loop to loop through a string. It doesn't necessarily have to be a list or a set or a collection of any type. So let me even use it to loop through a string here. So let's say I want to loop through just the banana. Okay, so see how it's going to print out to the console now. Okay, so let's run this. You see that it goes through this string and prints each item individually. So it shows you how powerful loops are. Loops can iterate through anything that is iterable. Okay, so we also can use the break statement on loops, like we use the break statement on while loops. We can use the break statement for for loops. So if you want to use the break statement for a for loop, it's just to add the break statement and your condition you want to test for before you break from the code. So look at this line of code now. I basically did the same thing. The only difference was that I added an if statement to test for when x is equals to banana in my list, then I break from it. Okay, so this is the same way you would go about using a break statement in a for loop. So if I run my code should break out when it hits banana. Okay, so now observe, my code went through the list. He found apple, printed it out to the console. He compared apple to see if it was equal to banana. It did not get a match. It went back and checked for banana, and banana was a match. Then it broke out. Okay, so this double equal to, you should observe by now, it checks to see the value of the variable. Okay, if I have 1 equal to, it assigns a value to the variable. Okay, but with double equal to, it checks to see if the value match. That's what's going on in the code there. So as we can use break, we can also use the continue statement. So for the continue statement, you just have to change it to continue. Then your code will work just as expected. So for the continue statement on for loops, I will just use the continue like so. So now look at it now. So it's just the same thing we did on the while loop. We will just check to see that, okay, if x is equals to banana, continue. So as you expect, it's going to loop through and ignore that banana, like ignore the number 3 on the while loop. The continue statement will just check to see if that condition is met. Then it goes back to the loop and starts from the last, from the next item, which is cherry. So that's how you can use the continue and the break. So we have one nice function that we can also test out with for loops. So we can use the range function. So the range function allows us to loop through a set of code at a specified number of times. Understand? So we can use that range function to return a sequence of numbers starting from 0, which is the default, and it increments by 1, okay, till it gets to the end of the specified number. So how would that look like? Let me just tweak this code a bit. Let me clear this up. So I would say for x in, so now the range function is like this. It's a keyword range, then I pass in the number of times I want to run my code, 6 times. Okay, so now I will now print the certain action I want to print. So obviously I want to print each item in that iteration, which is x. So this now is going to loop through my code and print from 0 to 5. That's how you count it. So 0 is the first number, 1 is the second, 2 is the third, 3 all the way to 5. So if I want to print the 6th number, I will just change this to 7. Then it runs all the way to 6. Then it stops, as you can see in my terminal here. The range function does not start from 1 to 7. Instead, it starts from 0 to 6. Okay, it starts from 0 to 6. So you know that by default arrays begin at 0. So just you have that mindset when working with range so that you don't get it mixed up. It starts from 0 to 6. So if you wanted to include 7, you change your range limits to 8. Then it works like that. So the range function defaults to 0 as a starting value, like I told you before. Yeah, so it's possible to still tweak your parameters. So if I want to like loop from 2 instead of 0, I would just come here and add an additional parameter like so. I want to loop from 2 instead of 0. I'll just add 2 here and I will try my code out, and you will see that my code will loop from 2 instead of 0. So this is an additional parameter you can add to the range function that allows you to loop from 2 now to 7. Like I told you before, the 7th number is not included because it starts from 2, 3, 4, 5 and ignores the last range you're putting there. So it stops at 6. So if you want to add 7, you know what to do. You add it there. Then now the last thing I want to show you is we can also change our sequence of incrementing. So it's incrementing by 1, as you can see here. But if I want to increment by, let's say, 2, I could just add a third parameter, and the third parameter becomes the number of increments that would make it that the range would increment by. So I'm running this code now for you to see. Let me clear my console so you can see how it will work. So now this loop is going to increment by 3 every given time. You see now it starts from 2, 5, 8, 11 all the way to 68. When it adds 3 more, it says that it's going to surpass 70, then it ends at 68. So if it's supposed to stop at 69, I would increment my loop by 1 by default. But by using 3, it goes overboard and stops there since it's beyond the limit of the range. So another thing we can also add is the else keyword, like we added in the while loop. So we can add the else keyword to indicate that okay, the loop has finished, and what else you want to do, you can do. Okay, so I was add the else keyword like this. I'll add the print statement and print to the console. What will I say? Okay, finally finished. So you don't get plenty text in there. Finally finished. Yeah. So when I run this again, I will see at the end of the loop, finally finished. So this is while loops and for loops for you in Python. So you could mix this up and have even nested for loops as your code gets more complex and you need to have a loop in a loop to try and loop through certain scenarios. Like, let me give you an instance here of a nested for loop. So this is a nested for loop. Now, let me explain what's happening here. So I'm trying to have a nested for loop to work in this manner. I want the first loop, that's the outer loop on line 4, to loop once. Then the loop on line 5 loops the whole sequence. So what's going to happen here is that, let me clear my console first. So what's going to happen here is that now this inner loop will loop once. It will loop the entire loop we have here for every iteration in the first loop. Okay, so my loop is going to loop red apple, red banana, red cherry. At the first go, it's going to come back again and loop big apple, big banana, big cherry. So let me show you that in the console. So you can see here I have red apple, red banana, red cherry. Same goes for the second item on the first list: big cherry, big banana, big apple, then tasty apple, tasty cherry. So what happens here is that the inner loop loops the whole items in the list, while the outer loop loops each item for an individual sequence on the second loop. So let me take that again. The inner loop loops the whole items there, while the outer loop loops an item per sequence in the fruit list. So that's how you have these results here. So this is how you would go about using a nested for loop. Then we also have the pass keyword, which you can pass in a loop if you don't want to have any action run in there for now. But your for loop cannot be empty, as we talked about in the if statements tutorial. But if for some reason you want to have an empty for loop, then come back and make some certain changes, you can use the pass keyword, and if you run your code, it will run without any error. But if you ignore the pass keyword here, you're definitely going to have an error, and you will see it in your console that indentation error, like we had in our last tutorial, expected an indented block. So that's it for loops in Python. Next, we're going to be talking about functions in our next tutorial, where you see us defining functions, calling functions, passing parameters to function. I hope to see you then. Cheers.